At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
Dès ma première rencontre avec M. Nehru, Delhi et à Chandigarh,
how from being a totally dusty plain, Chandigarh is now covered with greenery.
City must grow. It must be given a direction.
Hello and welcome to the story of Chandigarh, a podcast about how the modernist city of Chandigarh came into being and what its future might look like. This is Ishan Shafla, and with me is Dr. Vikramaditya Prakash. In today's episode, we explore the missing building of the capital complex, the Governor's Palace and the Museum of Knowledge. We explore the evolution of the Governor's Palace and Corbusier's idea of the museum. We also talk about the mythical status of Chandigarh in the West and the possibility of reinterpreting the program of the Museum of Knowledge. Let's talk today about the Governor's Palace and the Museum of Knowledge, which were the only unbuilt structures in the capital complex. Could you talk briefly about how the Governor's Palace was initially envisioned and then scaled down and then discarded, and then it was replaced by the Museum of Knowledge, which in turn itself was never built for various reasons?
Yes, exactly. So initially, as we have mentioned earlier also, the Governor's Palace was designed as the terminus of the capital complex. The Assembly and the High Court were kind of flanking buildings, and the visual focus was the Governor's Palace, and the Governor's Palace had a beautiful dramatic outline which was silhouetted against the Himalayas, right? It had this huge, beautiful pedestal. Then it had the main piano nobile in the middle, which was kind of like an overscaled Villa Savoye. And then on top of that, it had the inverted parasol roof looking up to and pointing up to the sky. And I think the piano nobile level was supposed to be the governor's residence. And the inverted parasol roof at the top with a beautifully designed stair going up to it was the place that was designed by Corbusier to sleep out under the stars at night. He was really enchanted by the idea that everybody in India sleeps on the terrace and the roof. Of course, nobody does that in Paris. And his soul was really Mediterranean. I mean, that's the funny thing about Corbusier. He was born in Switzerland. He ran from Switzerland, wanted to be part of the Paris avant-garde scene. But in the end, he retired on the Mediterranean because he fantasized about the warm waters and the warm sun. So in Chandigarh, one of his great fascination was the charpai. He loved the fact that people, basically carried the charpai on their head, and then they could put it out anywhere they want and then sleep under the stars. And he thought that was a great connection to the cosmos. And so when he was designing the governor's house, he said, well, you will sleep on the terrace, but you will sleep on the terrace in grand style. So the parasol roof was the place where he designed, where the governor and his family could go up and then sleep in the sky.
I see. So trying to elevate that everyday experience. That's probably one of the first things he saw, along with the bull that he was sketching when he first got here, right?
Yes, the bull and the charpai. He just loved these things. And he loved the gargoyles also, the thick mud walls of the villages.
So he kind of put the charpai on top of the horns of the bull.
That's true. That's right. The charpai on top of the horns of the
Found
bull.
a way to combine it.
That's right.
But I like this idea of collage that you briefly mentioned of the Governor's Palace as a kind of combination of Villa Savoye and the bull horns and then this open lower level. So is that unique to this building with Corbusier?
We made this collage actually when we ran the Chandigarh studios, and the
Yeah.
lower level can in fact be seen as the High Court. It's kind of the High
Right,
Court
right.
profile. And then on top of that sits an overscaled Villa Savoye, and then the horns of the bull at the top. So it's a collage. And it's a good question if it's unique to the governor's palace.
I mean, I guess you see instances of this in the assembly also, and maybe also the High Court, that there's elements that he's pulling from these disparate places and then combining them to make a whole.
Yes.
But in this one, it becomes very obvious. because
in this one, it becomes very
green.
obvious. Yes, very much so. I think it'd be a good exercise to take other Corbusier buildings and collage their references, collage their imagery. And Corbusier himself thought of it, the governor's palace, as a rampant bull, like a bull standing on its hind legs with his feet up, ready to like charge. And
it's also facing you, right?
And it's facing you. Yes. So in that sense, it's very masculine and erotic in one sense. And I think of it personally as, his sort of rivalry with Picasso. Because Picasso was, Spanish. He was a matador. He had this Spanish matador kind of a personality. He thought of himself as a bull amongst the cows, right? Picasso was a womanizer big time. He used to walk around, half dressed, and he made no bones about his obvious masculinity. He wouldn't work in today's cancel culture for sure. Whereas Corbusier never had that kind of, if you want cojones, that kind of balls. He was more of
Bravado.
he didn't have that bravado. He was more like, he was always in his suit and his bow tie and his jackets and big glasses, like all this, coverage on his body.
Except when he was painting with his pictures.
Only in Eileen Gray's house. When he was painting in making the mural in Eileen Gray's house, did he, he was naked, and he put up a photograph of himself naked. And that was like a big effort for him. And Eileen Gray was not there. He was alone in the house, and he had himself photographed and published. I think the photograph, I should say, I also did it. मैंने भी कर लिया. But it's like nothing.
There's also another one of him in a pool reading a book, naked.
Yeah, could be. Yes.
And I think it's the same place at Eileen Gray's villa.
Right. And Eileen Gray's villa, was right underneath, very close to his cabanon in south of France.
Achha.
So I think Beatrice Colomina has written some nice critiques and readings of that situation. It's like Picasso was a bull. He would stand amongst the hens and say, I'm here, I want and I take, Whereas Corbusier, he's like sneaking into Eileen Gray's apartment and trying to get something going, but basically botches up, looks like an idiot in the end. Like, who? Like it's kind of like sordid to be painting a mural in somebody else's house and then photographing yourself naked while doing it. I mean, it's like stupid and weirdly perverse. Whereas
it's an interesting image, yeah.
Very
iconic.
It's an iconic image. Whereas you get Picasso, he didn't give a shit. So the aspiration of the governor's palace, to return to the topic at hand, was a rampant bull structure. Whereas the assembly, the bull is standing down, right? Feet down. The governor's palace, the bull stands up.
It's his way of claiming ownership of the bull.
Yes, and to sort of project onto the figure of the governor, which for Corbusier was really the figure of Nehru, what a architecture of a dominant male would look like. I think that's what the governor's palace design can be described as, the architecture of a dominant male.
Because that would also have been the only building facing the city. Right?
That would have been the only building facing the city. But really, he had the landscape of the Himalayas behind him, the Shivalik hills. In that sense, as a portrait, as a kind of a portrait of the dominant male with the landscape behind it, we were talking earlier, we were discussing Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci also painted all his portraits, like even the famous Mona Lisa, as a figure with a deep landscape behind it. Right? All of Da Vinci's paintings have these landscapes going deep into the distance behind them. And Da Vinci wanted to establish a relationship between landscape and the human consciousness. So there's that kind of an echo. Corbusier self-consciously was also arguing with Leonardo da Vinci when Corbusier made the modular man in his golden ratio square, right? He was trying to replace or modernize and update Leonardo da Vinci's drawing of the Vitruvian Man, which of course was Leonardo's just sketch of Vitruvius's claim about how the human body is involved in squaring the circle. So anyway, I say all this to say it faces the city, but the dominant figure, the rampant bull presents itself as belonging to a landscape or belonging to nature. The dominant bull becomes dominant by ensuring that he is well anchored in nature, not in the city.
In the interior of the governor's palace, there's kind of these squiggly curves, sort of like almost Ronchamp-esque, that are competing for space on the inside. Like, is that a result of the nature of the program, that the interior is sort of fluid looking? Like, what was the program like?
All those curvy rooms. So basically, it's a free plan, right? He has, I think, the 9 columns, 9 massive concrete piers. They aren't really columns, they're like huge piers. They
and
go
they're cruciform, right?
They're cruciform. So in that sense, they're also a reference to the cruciform columns that Mies van der Rohe used for the Barcelona pavilion. But in Mies' cases, of course, they are steel, and he coated them in chrome so that they sort of disappear. Whereas here, these would be massive concrete piers, very brutalist. And then he was basically playing with free form, how to make forms. And he made all those curved spaces. I think those are not in the governor's palace, or it's some chamber. He's just basically exploring free form. I think there is an allusion because in the assembly building, he talks about the 2 assembly chambers as stomachs.
Right.
So if there's an animal, those are the stomachs. So you can think of these curvy rooms kind of packed together as kind of organs, like inside the human body, like the liver, kidney, and so on. So with circulation system being so there is definitely a sort of biomorphic reference in the making of those things.
But was the ground level supposed to be public?
Corbusier imagined that this was the executive branch. He was imagining the governor's palace as a answer to Lutyens' viceroy's house in Delhi, which was the terminus of New Delhi. And B, he was thinking of the governor's palace as kind of India's White House, right? Because he was like, well, you need the executive building as a representation of a strong central authority. So that was his thinking. But of course, as you know, the famous thing is that Nehru saw the project and he said, we don't need this. He said the governor can, first of all, the governor is a nobody in India, right?
Like the president.
Like the president. He's like only figurehead. And Nehru liked the idea of that the chief minister, who's the real seat of power, should live in a regular house, like all the other ministers. Because Nehru because we have a parliamentary form of democracy, and Nehru very much imbibed, I think, the aesthetic of 10 Downing Street, right? In London, 10 Downing Street presents itself as just another brownstone, just another house. Of course, behind the door, it's massive. But visually, it's like, oh, it's just another house. The prime minister lives here, nothing special. Whereas in the United States, the president, lives in the White House.
Right.
So Nehru preferred that.
So at that stage, Nehru insisted that it be scrapped entirely, or what was the thinking behind scaling it down?
Well, so scaling it down was a different thing. Corbusier first made it, and it was a huge building. And when the drawings went for costing, they were like, this is going to cost even more than the Secretariat. So they said, this is insane. So Corbusier scaled it down. That's all.
Using the modular.
So it was quick and easy to scale it down for him. It still would have been very dramatic. So
the drawings that we usually see, are they of the original one or the scaled down one?
That's a good question. I think depends on which edition of the Oeuvre you go to. It's the same building, exactly the same building. It's just scaled down. I mean, it's a good question. I've never looked at that carefully. Like what did the original look like and what did the scaled down version look like?
Yeah, it'd be interesting to overlap the two and see.
That's right.
What was the time period between the end of the governor's palace and the beginning of the Museum of Knowledge? Was that immediate, or was there the churning in the middle where they were kind of mulling over what to do instead?
Yeah, it took some time. I think Nehru sort of rejected the project around 1955. But basically, Corbusier turned instead of his attention to the assembly and kind of put all the dramatic elements into the assembly. So the assembly became the assembly we know today after Nehru refused the governor's palace. So essentially, the rampant bull, the bull standing up on its hind legs, kind of went down. And you can read this as a sexual metaphor if you like. But like he sort of got back down on his haunches, four legs on the ground, and the horns in front and the hump behind in the form of the assembly chamber. And he stands resolute, but he's no longer a rampant bull. Now he's a bull standing on the ground as he normally does. He's a beast of burden, not a rampant bull. He's like, okay, I'm here, I'm tough, I'm strong, you can yoke me, and I will pull the load as I've always done.
So he embedded a bunch of theatrics into the building to make up for the absence.
Yes. So he sort of pushed all that bull imageries into the assembly and made it the center of the Capitol complex.
I mean, he did that probably knowing at the back of his mind there's still a vacuum there where the governor's palace was supposed to be, right?
Yeah, so he was like, what do I do there? And at that time, he was also starting to design the School of Art and the museum complex in Sector 10. And initially, he just made the museum as a cut-paste job. You know, he had the Museum of Infinite Growth, which had been going on. He had been designing the museum for like 40, 50 years. He started designing museums in the 1920s, starting with the Mundaneum for Paul Otlet. And then from the Mundaneum, he had started to figure out what a museum should be, what a modern museum should be. Because initially he hated museums. He thought museums are horrible places. But then he started to say, well, what would a modern museum be? So he started to make the museum and started to make cultural complexes around it. But no museums were built basically until after World War II. He designed a lot of museums and museum complexes, but in the end, only 3 museums were made, one in Ahmedabad, one in Chandigarh, and one in Tokyo. So the museum was a well-established project of his. And basically, he did a version of that in Sector 10. And that's when my father also started to work with him, because he first started with the School of Art as kind of an ancillary institution to the museum.
But he didn't call it the School of Art, did he? It was the Audiovisual Training Center.
He called it the Audiovisual Training Center, but I'll come to that in a minute, but the original project was School of Art.
Yeah.
Then I think it was in 1958 or something. Corbusier was invited to Italy by Olivetti. Yeah, he was a techie. Olivetti was making some of the earliest computers in the world.
Oh, I thought he was just making typewriters.
Well, he was making typewriters also, but he was moving on to computers.
I see.
He was a smart guy. And so he invited Corbusier to make the Olivetti building, which I don't remember what the program of it was. I don't think it was a manufacturing center. I think it was a administrative center. You can look it up. It's a beautiful building, the Olivetti building. Not built, but the design is fantastic.
It looks a little bit like Algiers.
Yeah, it has some of those qualities. So the point being that when he was designing the Olivetti building, Olivetti introduced Corbusier to the computer. And he learned of, at that time, the data would be recorded in these massive spools, big spools that turned like this, that turned round and round like old spool tape recorders.
What kind of data?
Whatever the computer was churning.
Okay.
So there was a box, big mainframe computers from the old days were big boxes, and the data was kept in these huge spools. And Olivetti explained to Corbusier that, how much data can sit on one spool. And Corbusier fell in love with that concept because he designed museums. He said museums should have infinite growth because knowledge grows forever. And he said, well, now you can store all knowledge in these, what he called round books, because Corbusier was a big book fellow, right? He designed books. He loved books, his entire oeuvre and so on. And he thought, oh my God, now all the data is going to be stored digitally in what he called round books.
Yeah. But does anyone actually know what round books entails? Or is it more sort of conjecture and guesswork? Like, was he very precise with how he described them?
For him, those were the spools, the recording spools of computers. The data was kept in these round spools.
It's like a modern library.
So basically said, you can hold a whole library of information in one spool. He got that.
So his fascination was the kind of compression of a lot of information into a very tiny space.
That's right. And from his perspective, now you could hold infinite information in very little space.
So essentially, he's making a version of a data center.
Well, they had just started to make a round book is a data center. Yeah. So the problem was he realized that the museum, as he has been designing it, is redundant and useless, that the future museum is all going to be digital. So he said, if all the future museum is going to be digital and is held in these round books, which can essentially sit in basements, then what is a museum anymore? This is the question he asked himself. And that's when he invented the project of the Museum of Knowledge.
I mean, it's a very provocative idea, just the name of the building itself.
Yes.
Because museum...
Connaissance. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a weird sort of juxtaposition.
Yes. So he wanted to distinguish between information and knowledge.
What's the difference?
Data on a spool for him was information. Knowledge is asking questions of the data and getting the answers you want.
Like making connections between sets of data. Yeah.
Right. He said data exists, but somebody has to ask the question and be there to receive the answer and implement it. So I think there's a quotation by Corbusier. He says, yes, this is all very impressive, but you still need someone who asks the question. Right. So the Museum of Knowledge was designed as a place where you can ask the question and receive the answer. And for him, the questions that he was interested in were visual.
So it's very prophetic in today's context as well.
Yeah.
Because look, you have all these AI assistants, but you still need someone to make the right combination of words as a prompt to get the right information, pull the right information out of it. It's only going to tell you what you ask of it.
Yes. So this has become an extremely important question today. What is the relationship between human asking and AI thinking, or human thinking and AI thinking? And so this is like the burning question of our times today. And I think it can be reasonably said Corbusier anticipated this question when he made the Museum of Knowledge. He did not anticipate the answer. He anticipated the question. He did not know what would be the relationship between asking human and the data centers. And like, how would one use this richly? And for him, the big asking and answer getting was visual and spatial. Like the tough questions of life were not talk, but see, know, and make, right?
Did you have concerns about like how we have concerns about AI being a threat to creative thought and creative thinking, because you outsource so much thinking to an external entity that you don't have to do any of the hard work of, making connections and asking questions?
I don't think he did, because I think that was still too advanced for at that time. We're talking late 50s and early 60s.
Right.
So the idea that there would be this kind of artificial intelligence, I think, was still very speculative. I think there were people already starting to write about that, but it was... Corbusier was in that sense a dedicated modernist, right? I mean, he thought this is technology and technology can be used simply for human good. Well, by the late 60s, those questions were already in play, because we have to remember Stanley Kubrick made 2001 A Space Odyssey in 1968, right?
You're right. 68.
68. So Stanley Kubrick was already deeply...
Yeah.
So therefore, Arthur C. Clarke and all these people were already writing, right? So I guess I'm wrong. I think the dangers and possibilities of AI were already anticipated, even by the early 60s.
Did Corbusier have a clear idea of the building, or there was unfinished elements, kind of like the larger plaza, which would be in line with his thinking about the program of the Museum of Knowledge? Was he open-minded and left room for maneuvering in the future?
My argument is that he did not know what the program of a Museum of Knowledge should be. I mean, he laid out some kind of a program, but I think it was all just a made up program to try and convince the authorities to make something over there. Because he said somehow these machines will give you the answers that you need to govern. But I think he had no idea.
Still very, very bold of him to propose something that he understands very little of. Is that a modernist ideal to accommodate and to be optimistic about the future in a way that you make room for things, even like, I guess, modes of transport and things like that?
So, yeah, so we have to remember modernism in general was about future making. Like it has the idea we have to get to a better future. And that leads to the idea of utopia design and utopian panning. Like,
Yeah.
And that was certainly a strong trait in modernism and certainly a strong trait in Corbusier's work, particularly in the interwar years between the 20s, 30s. Yeah. But after World War II, modernism and people like Corbusier were not so sure about themselves because they saw that science and reason could also lead to the atom bomb. And they saw that rationalization, standardization could also be used for the Holocaust. The Germans efficiently murdered 5 million Jews, very efficiently. So in the 50s, with the coming of brutalism, Bruton, part of the thinking about brutalism was to expose and talk about the ugliness of modernity, but not to sugarcoat it, but to leave it kind of, in a sense, ugly. So Corbusier was a more diffident person in terms of his relationship to technology and utopian thinking by the time he came to the Chandigarh Museum of Knowledge. But of course, Chandigarh was supposed to be a vision of the future, right? Or rather an expression of a nation's faith in the future, right?
Right.
So futurity, future thinking was fundamental, central, and the whole point of Chandigarh. But I have argued that because of a more diffident and uncertain relationship to the idea of future as utopia, Corbusier conceived the idea of the future, particularly in the capital complex, if not in the urban plan, certainly in the capital complex, as something that has yet to be figured out. Whereas utopia says, we've got it, we know it, here's the blueprint, go ahead and do it the best you can. Corbusier in the capital complex says the future, what the future should be and how it should be made is still A, TBD, we don't know, and B, we may never know. It may always be a TBD, a work in progress.
That's a very Derridian idea.
Well, that's my Derridian reading of it. Yeah, yes. It's always deferred.
Because the future will always be in the future.
Right. But futurity, the idea of getting somewhere. But that is not to say you don't strive for it. Like the modernist impulses, we've got to make a better tomorrow.
Like problem solving. Yeah.
Problem solving and faith and investment in the idea of progress. If you're not solving problems, and if you don't have faith and investment in the idea of the progress, you're not a modernist.
Mm-hmm.
To remain invested in that, but to give up on the idea of known blueprints and utopias is embodied in Corbusier's unfinished design of the Museum of Knowledge. He couldn't solve it. Like even today, we don't know what is our relationship between human agency and digital agency, right? So this was already anticipated, in Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke's writings at that time. And people like Corbusier would have, you have to have a certain amount of world knowledge to, in the 1960s, Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick were worrying about computers becoming so intelligent. In the 60s, people were like, yeah, okay, this is science fiction. But today, finally, the chickens have come home to roost. 23 years later, right? They said, Stanley Kubrick said by 2001, we will have this problem, but it has taken longer than that.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting if Elon Musk's starships are run by AI, what will happen? So we are now finally arriving at that cusp. This is a tough one.
Yeah.
And Corbusier basically left it unfinished. He's saying, I don't know, but that's the problem. I'm stating he states the problem, but doesn't have a solution.
Well, that's half the work, though, recognizing that there is
Yeah.
That question, that problem
Yeah.
exists.
Yes, Corbusier used to say often, half the issue is stating the problem correctly. Once you state the problem correctly, the solution becomes much easier. But in this case, he correctly, accurately stated the problem, but did not have a solution. Which is why it is hilarious to me that under the influence of postmodernism, in when was it? I think 2001 or somewhere, there was this conference held in Chandigarh celebrating Chandigarh, so on and so forth. All this postmodernism influenced people said, oh my God, they must complete the Capitol complex. They must build the Museum of Knowledge, but they didn't like Corbusier's box design of a Museum of Knowledge. They wanted to make the Governor's Palace and call it
As
the
the
Museum of Knowledge, as a Museum of Knowledge, which is like
Oh, yeah.
the, historic preservation sleight of hand. It's like, it's such a bizarre thing to complete something, but preserve its original design as if it's an act of preservation and completion. It's sort of so strange.
And that almost went through, right?
Almost went through. It probably might even still go through, but it's completely unintellectual. It's just like we love Governor's Palace, which is a beautiful building.
Yeah.
We just love it. We like it. It would look really nice. Corbusier wanted it, they say, and make it.
Well, that makes it sound like a very Ram Mandir project.
It is kind of, it's an interesting concept. Yeah, it's a Ram Mandir kind of reading. I'm fine saying that.
Yeah, that they just want to see it,
हम तो वही बनाएंगे. How? I mean, as a formalist, I'm sympathetic to the cause because I love the Governor's Palace. It's a gorgeous building. And, under John Haydock, they did this amazing deconstruction of the building at the Cooper Union. There's a great model that they made and broke it up. And then I made my assembly model at University of Washington, imitative of the way they made the Governor's Palace model. But by the time Haydock was teaching, it was the late 70s and 80s, and under postmodernism, Corbusier was reduced to a formalist, which he was a gorgeous formalist. He made amazing buildings. Cornell was a Corbusier formalist school. But since postmodernism criticized Corbusier's intellectuality by saying, oh, he made utopian grand visions of the master, they were like, okay, we're going to abandon Corbusier's intellectualities and keep his formalism. And that is what sort of created the Richard Meyer kind of school of Corbusier thinking.
Why did they abandon Corbusier's intellectualism, you think?
Because Jane Jacobs, Louis Mumford and company said that Corbusier's urban visions have resulted in the disasters of modern urban life. Pruitt-Igoe's demolition was highlighted by people like Charles Jenks as the end and disaster of modernism. They blamed American urban blight on Corbusian visions of the towers in the park.
Okay, I see. His plan for, what was it?
Was a contemporary city, the radiant city, and all that. Yeah.
So they said Pruitt-Igoe is what would happen if Corbusier was given free rein.
They saw Pruitt-Igoe as the manifestation of Corbusian thinking.
Not Chandigarh, though.
They didn't know Chandigarh. They just, threw the baby out with the bathwater. Like Chandigarh is part of Corbusian thinking and therefore bad. Then the Corbusier walas were, no, but he's a great artist and great formalist, which he is. And they're sort of like, we've got to keep. And then Villa Savoie became the greatest Corbusier building, which is a work of high formalism. So sort of like the New York Five in the 1970s, for instance, they all, like from Peter Eisenman, Richard Meyer, and early Michael Graves, and so on, they were like, you would dissect Corbusier formally. And Richard Meyer and Peter Eisenman, in a sense, stayed the course. They were competing derivative formalists. You were just at the Getty Center in LA.
Right.
Getty Center is like a Corbusian wet dream, right? But Corbusier from the 1920s and 30s, not Corbusier in Chandigarh.
Right. But how so? Like that's something Corbusier would have done in the 20s?
Well, that's Richard Meyer's version that if, in a sense, if Corbusier was alive today and got this massive project on the hills of Los Angeles, how he would possibly pass and organize things and lay them out and how they would flow and what they would look like. And sort of it's a vision of modernity.
But it's still, you think that's in line with Corbusian formalism,
Totally.
the moves
Yeah,
that he's
yeah.
making.
Absolutely.
You know, that's interesting you bring that up. We were in Hadrian's Villa near Rome.
Yeah, yeah.
And my professor was like pointing out this is Cornell thinking is
Yes.
derived from this building because of there's like a fulcrum and, you know, everything is sort of like originating from there, that axis.
Well, Colin Rowe loved Hadrian's Villa. Colin Rowe is one of the primary authors of Le Corbusier's formalism. You know, all these people, Michael Graves, Richard Meyer, Peter Eisenman, they're all students of Colin Rowe. Matthias, you know, people known as the Texas Rangers. John Haydock also is a sort of is a Corbusier 2.0 formalist, though Haydock did invest in sort of high intellectuality, but of his own kind.
Yeah.
Haydock didn't actively take on politics and society at large. Libius Woods, as a kind of a derivative of John Haydock, did.
Oh, I thought Haydock was engaging politically with his, what do you call them, masks? There's those little folies.
Follies, yeah, yeah, yeah. So in a limited way, but you know, Haydock didn't publish big urban plans. You didn't
Yeah.
teach high big urbanism in at Cooper Union. It was sort of interventionist and specific and focused.
But very powerful nonetheless in kind of developing a milieu or like a school of thought similar to the AA in London.
Absolutely. There is Haydock created the most amazing school of thought, like the AA under what was his name? Balfour. So AA and Cooper Union, and then in a different way, SciArc later, were the sort of intellectual bastions of architecture. Nevertheless, for everybody, Chandigarh is like a mythic place in the West, particularly in America. You know, when I showed up at Cornell and I would very quietly introduce myself as being from Chandigarh, because in India in the 1980s, you did not say very loudly you are from Chandigarh in architecture circles, because Chandigarh was the bad boy. It was not Indian. And to do Indian architecture at that time, you had to be working on mandalas or Jaisalmer or, you know, the Havelis or something like that. In the 80s, it was, you know, everybody, Charles Correa, Doshi, Raj Rival, you name it, Uttam Jain, anybody, they were all like studying history. So in India, you did not go around saying you're from Chandigarh. But I came to America in the 80s. And even though postmodernism was even big at that time, Corbusier was still a huge figure. And I said, I'm from Chandigarh. You know, doors opened for me. You know, Cornell, everybody's like, oh my God, just Chandigarh has this mythic status. Even when I went to Cooper Union to do reviews, you know, Chandigarh would have a mythic status. And we organized the conference in Chandigarh in 1990, what was it, 5 or something, 4 or 5, January 95. And oh my God, everybody showed up. I used to have professors calling me up and say, can you give me a small role as a moderator of a panel? I just want to come to Chandigarh, you know, this way I can get justification for funding.
Did that ever change, you think? Or is that still the norm?
I think that's still alive. I think that's still alive. Even till this day, don't you get visitors from all over the world? Everybody has to do Tirth Yatra, a pilgrimage to Chandigarh. If you're an architect and you have been schooled in the history of modern architecture, you have to go to Chandigarh.
Yeah.
I think there is the new generation now being trained under sustainability and technology that probably has not heard of Corbusier. I think Corbusier is now a waning star, maybe in the last 10, 15 years.
Hard to say. But I do see the people visiting Chandigarh that have skipped Delhi. You know, they do Chandigarh, Ahmedabad, maybe
Yes.
Pondicherry. Yeah.
Yes.
Or like Auroville.
Yeah. So that kind of thinking, people who still have a kind of a little bit of a faith in modernism.
But why do you think that is, like the mythical status of Chandigarh? Is it partly because it's hasn't been studied as much, or just because those people haven't visited it yet, they have this fascination with it?
They have the fascination because Corbusier is the defining intellectual mind of architecture of the 20th century. Nobody has still kind of replaced him. And this is his largest and most unusual project. And it's far away.
Yeah.
And it's in sort of this India, which already has a mythical character, you know, Beatles showing up as a spiritual place. So it has a double exotic to it.
Yeah. And hence the obsession and the fetishization of the furniture, you know.
That's exactly right. That's a very good connection. Yeah.
People who've never been here want a piece of it.
Yes.
Somehow.
That's right. Exactly right. Exactly right. That's a very good observation. Yeah, Chandigarh is a fetish for the West. That's a good way to describe it. And then these are fetishistic objects, therefore. That's a good paper to write.
I mean, that has been, I guess, studied a little bit. People are starting to take an interest in that angle of neo-colonialism.
Well, there's a
Tendency.
neo-colonialist angle, which they say we gave you the great Corbusier and you threw his furniture away. That's neo-colonial.
Like the British Museum sort of model.
Yeah, sort of. That's the neo-colonial part. But why the hell are you interested in this anyway is a sort of fetishistic obsession. And it's orientalist. Yes, orientalistic fetishization. So it's worth thinking like, what would be an art installation? So here's a project for you. Like
Burn the chair.
Burn the chairs. Or that would be, I have proposed. But like, how would you respond to the fact that you have a factory that is making these chairs and contributing to the fetishistic economy? So do a critique of your own performance in this economy via an art project.
So we haven't actually spoken about the formal aesthetics of the Museum of Knowledge.
Yeah, there aren't any.
Do you think
It's
it would have
just
been an eyesore if it did come up?
Yeah, totally. Because it's an
Like out of
incomplete
place.
design. Yeah, it's not done. It's not cooked. Corbusier was still working on it when he died. Corbusier died unexpectedly in 65, right? 65. Yeah, 65. He was still a young, swimming in south of France, in the Mediterranean. He had a heart attack, but he was only 75 years old. He was not an old man. He was still walking, talking, completely coherent. I think he probably anticipated he would live longer, though there's all this discussion that he certainly had a premonition he was at the end of his life. But it was an incomplete job. I mean, even the Venice hospital was vastly more designed than the Museum of Knowledge. But the Venice hospital was a, in a sense, clear project, and he could the program was clear, the purpose was clear, the question was clear. He could, execute the design. So there's not much to the design. There's sort of a weird hyperbolic paraboloid roof at the top, and I would give it a B- in studio.
If it was a thesis project.
If it was a thesis project, I would give it an A+, because if it would ask it says if the thesis was, I can't design this because I don't know what the project is, I would give you an A+.
Yeah.
For thesis, it would get A+. But if this was a basic studio and the program was given and you make a design, I'd say, ye kya hona hai? Whereas, just as a formalist design, the governor's palace is by far the A++ design.
Well, that is telling that, kind of afterthought. So in the case of the Museum of Knowledge, since it's more of a question, the question itself and the program takes precedence over the formal aesthetics and the envelope and the building.
That's right.
And maybe he was a bit disheartened by the lack of the governor's palace.
Maybe that played. But I would say he raised the stakes, as they say in poker, no? He said, okay, the replacement building will be even more significant. But it is so significant that even he didn't know what to do with it. The day of AI is finally coming when we can start to think about the Museum of Knowledge. Now we have finally arrived at the situation where one can ask these questions.
I think that might be the most popular thesis project, actually.
It should be. It should be. And that's why at the Office of Uncertainty Research, we wanted to try and do this. It's still incomplete. But really, we need Arthur C. Clarke and a lot of science fiction people thinking about these things. But it's a great project. One could have a serious conference on programming the Museum of Knowledge, AI, and all this.
Maybe the Museum of Knowledge is a ephemeral event in that area of the Capitol complex. Is like something happens ever so frequently where people get together and ask the questions.
Sure, a tent, a tambu, temporary building
style.
Venice Biennale style. Yeah, maybe it should be the site for biennales. The problem with biennales is they're so contaminated now by the art industry.
But that would be quite something. Or like the Serpentine is a good reference. What if the Capitol complex dedicated that site to and brought on one contemporary architect every year to reinterpret the Museum of Knowledge? So it's not a permanent thing, but like a structure that's always evolving based on the ethos of that moment in time.
That's a great idea. Yeah, that's a great idea. Then every year there would be this conversation of who's designing it and who's making it and who gets rewarded to it. And that would attract all these people, and it would make the Capitol complex a contemporary site.
Yeah, like charged, alive.
Yeah, instead of just like a preserved museum piece with, managed tours, which is what it is now, which is better than what it used to be, but at least. But it would make it, and the British really know how to do this kind of things well, how to sort of integrate contemporary art into preservation. Yeah. I mean, that's a great idea.
Because right now it's just reeks of bureaucracy and barbed wire. So I think that would be a great step up if a version of that can happen. And then we can have, satellite events or structures across the city at the same time.
You could, and then that could be the basis of more events in the city. Well, it'll be really tough in Chandigarh, imagination.
Ego-wise, to make it happen, convincing.
Yeah, how do you convince somebody to have that kind of a vision? All we need is one good governor and one good administrator. It can be done.
Thanks for listening to The Story of Chandigarh. This is your host and producer, Ishan Chawla. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email us at storyofchandigarh@gmail.com. We'll continue our conversation in the next episode. Until then, this is The Story of Chandigarh.